The music stopped. A single note hung in the air, quivering as if the entire ballroom was holding its breath. Catherine Whitmore stood in the corner, unnoticed, the fabric of her dress faintly rustling in the oppressive silence. Her gaze drifted over the room, watching the high society of Europe whirl and dance, their laughter bright and rich. She wasn't part of this world, never would be. She had been raised to be invisible, to fit into the cracks of grand mansions like a forgotten portrait. Her family had fallen, their wealth squandered, and she was left to pick up the pieces of her own life. The noblemen and women passed her by without a glance, each one lost in their own world of privilege. But then it happened. The door to the ballroom opened, and the air shifted. Duke Edward Ashford entered. His presence was like a storm rolling in. The room stilled, the music almost forgotten. He moved with the kind of grace that commanded respect, the weight of his title settling in the air around him. He was powerful, untouchable, and in that moment, Catherine felt every inch of her place in this world, beneath him, beneath all of them. His eyes scanned the room, never stopping on the faces of the women who waited for his attention. His gaze was cold, calculating, as if he was searching for something more than what society had to offer. And then it happened. His eyes landed on her. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to pause. Time itself held its breath. Catherine's heart pounded in her chest as she felt the weight of his gaze. She couldn't look away. She didn't know if she wanted to. His eyes were piercing, gray like the stormy seas, and they seemed to see right through her, unraveling every bit of her carefully crafted mask. Every whisper, every sneer from the others in the room melted away in the face of his gaze. The Duke moved, slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. People stepped aside without a word. He did not speak, did not acknowledge the whispers that followed him as he approached. It was as if the air itself parted for him, his presence overwhelming. He stopped in front of her. His hand, large and steady, reached out. The room was frozen, every eye on the two of them. Catherine's pulse raced, the echo of his hand in the air, sending a shock through her body. She felt small, insignificant, but also something else. Something she couldn't name. The silence in the room was deafening. Duke Edward did not speak. He did not need to. His hand hovered, just inches from her face, before gently cupping her chin. His touch was cool, commanding. He held her there, not allowing her to look away, his gaze locked onto hers. He said nothing, but in the space between them, words hung heavy. She was not who they thought she was. She was not the one they expected. The power in that moment crackled, and Catherine could feel the shift, the world around her moving in slow motion as she stood, caught in the Duke's hold. His voice finally cut through the silence, low, calm, and undeniably powerful. "You," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken decisions. "You are the one I choose." A gasp rippled through the crowd, but Catherine didn't hear it. She only heard the Duke's words. The world shifted in an instant. Catherine was no longer invisible. She was seen, chosen, and nothing would ever be the same again. Catherine stood there, frozen in the Duke's grasp, her heart racing as the weight of the room pressed in around her. His hand, warm yet commanding, cupped her chin, the world narrowing to the space between them. The ballroom, once alive with music and conversation, was now eerily silent, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The Duke's gaze never wavered, his eyes locked onto hers with a calm intensity that left her feeling exposed and yet, strangely, seen. She could feel the power in him, his control, his confidence, and the disparity between their worlds became all too clear. He had the world at his feet. She had nothing. And yet, here they were. He didn't speak immediately, his fingers barely brushing against her skin as he held her in place. The tension between them thickened, a current running through the air that neither of them could escape. Catherine's chest tightened, her breath shallow, but she refused to look away. This was a moment of reckoning, and she could feel it. The crowd watched in rapt attention, no one daring to make a sound, as if the very act of speaking might shatter the delicate balance between them. Duke Edward finally spoke, his voice soft but carrying an undeniable authority. "You're not like the others." His words hit her like a shockwave, each one digging deeper into her soul. The others, the noble women in the room, all vying for his attention, all far more suitable than she was. Yet he chose her. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. "I've seen you," he continued, his voice low and steady. "Not in the way they do. You're not just another pretty face, another trinket to adorn my arm." The Duke's words echoed in her mind, his gaze still unwavering. She was not like the others. And in that moment, Catherine felt something stir within her. It was not pride, not vanity, but a strange sense of recognition. The Duke had chosen her, not because of her beauty, not because of her station, but because of something else. Something raw and real that no one else had noticed. His thumb brushed against her skin, just enough to remind her that this was no dream. His touch was cold, but his presence was suffocatingly warm, filling the space between them in ways she couldn't understand. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs, the sound almost deafening in her ears. She had been invisible for so long, just a shadow in the corners of this grand world. But now, she was in the center of it all. His gaze never left her face, his lips slightly parted, as if he were contemplating something far greater than she could comprehend. She could feel the weight of his thoughts, pressing down on her, and for a moment, she wondered if this was all just a game to him. Did it matter who he chose? Did it matter who he touched? Catherine didn't know. She only knew that in this moment, she was caught in the Duke's orbit, and there was no escaping. As he stepped back, his hands slowly falling from her chin, she could almost feel the space between them crackle with unspoken words. The room, still silent, seemed to hold its collective breath. The Duke's voice broke the stillness once more, a command that was both an invitation and a decree. "Follow me." His words hung in the air, like the calm before a storm. Catherine didn't move immediately. She couldn't. She wasn't sure if she could. The moment had shifted her, and she felt like she was teetering on the edge of something monumental. But then, with a quiet exhale, she took a step forward. And another. Each step toward him was a step away from the world she knew, away from the shadows she had lived in. As the Duke turned, leading her through the sea of eyes, Catherine felt a strange sense of power ripple through her. She was not a victim. She was not a pawn in his game. She was part of this world now, whether she liked it or not. And the Duke, with his quiet authority and overwhelming presence, had chosen her. For better or worse, she was his. As they moved through the ballroom, the crowd parted like water before a storm. No one dared approach, no one dared speak. The Duke was the center of it all, and she, by his side, was something far more than a mere spectator. She was part of the story now. She was no longer invisible. But the question remained, was she ready for the world that awaited her? Catherine could feel the weight of Duke Edward's gaze as they walked through the grand ballroom. Every step was a reminder of how little she belonged in this world, her footsteps light, almost hesitant, as she followed him. His stride was purposeful, every movement emanating power and confidence, while she felt as though the air itself was pressing in on her. The space between them felt vast, yet there was something undeniable pulling her toward him. She wanted to look away, to retreat, but his presence was too commanding. They passed through the sea of whispering aristocrats, their eyes wide, filled with curiosity and judgment. The murmurs followed them, but the Duke's presence silenced them all. Catherine's pulse quickened as she tried to steady her breath, each footstep louder in her ears, each second heavier than the last. She had been invisible for so long, yet now, with him by her side, she felt every pair of eyes fixated on her. And yet, despite the eyes, despite the whispers, the Duke's hand remained firmly at her back, guiding her, leading her as if she belonged here. She didn't. But the way his hand rested on her was a reminder that, in this moment, he had chosen her. As they neared the far corner of the room, the Duke stopped suddenly, causing her to halt in her tracks. Without warning, he turned, his eyes locking with hers, a flicker of something darker, something deeper in his gaze. "Stay," he commanded, his voice low, steady, and sharp. The word was not a request. It was a decree. Catherine stood still, unable to speak, unable to move. His command was like a chain around her, and she felt the weight of it pressing down on her. She was not just a noblewoman anymore. She was his. She could feel the power shift again. Once more, she was at his mercy. She had no place in his world, and yet here she was, by his side. The room seemed to hold its breath as the Duke led her to a secluded part of the ballroom, far from the rest of the guests. The music felt distant now, as though it had been replaced by the rhythmic pounding of her heart. He stopped, turned to face her, and for the first time, his eyes softened ever so slightly, but only for a moment. Then, without another word, he reached out, his hand closing around hers, pulling her toward him with an effortless strength. She didn't resist. She couldn't. His grip was firm, his presence overwhelming. She felt small under his touch, but she also felt something else, something she couldn't name, something that made her heart race even faster. His thumb brushed against her skin, and for a moment, it felt as if the world had stopped spinning. His eyes never left hers, his breath steady but heavy in the stillness between them. The tension between them grew, crackling in the air like an electric current. Catherine could feel the weight of every word he hadn't spoken, the heaviness of his silence pressing in on her. He was in control. She was not. But in that moment, it was more than just control, it was a shift. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she could feel it. The way he held her hand, the way he moved, the way he looked at her, it was as if he were deciding something crucial. Her breath caught in her throat, the words she wanted to say trapped behind her lips. She wanted to ask him why, to demand answers, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. His eyes flicked to her lips, then back to her eyes, and for a split second, Catherine felt as though he could read her thoughts. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he leaned in just slightly, his face inches from hers. His breath was warm against her skin, his scent filling her senses. "You will never be invisible again," he whispered, so softly she almost missed it. But she didn't. His words echoed in her mind. A promise, a threat, she wasn't sure which. The air between them felt thick, the tension building with every passing second. Catherine's pulse raced, her heart pounding in her chest, as the Duke straightened, his grip still firm on her hand. His eyes held hers for a moment longer, and then, without a word, he turned and began to walk away, pulling her along with him. The ballroom opened up before them, the crowd parting as they moved. No one dared approach, no one dared speak. The Duke was a force, and Catherine, whether she liked it or not, was caught in his orbit. She was no longer invisible. She was his. And as they reached the center of the room, the music began to swell once more, but Catherine didn't hear it. All she could hear was the steady beat of her own heart, the echo of the Duke's words in her mind. The world around her had shifted, and she was left to wonder, was she ready for it? Catherine's heart was still racing from the Duke's words, his presence so overwhelming that the room felt suffocating. He had chosen her, the woman everyone had ignored, the one who had never belonged. She had only known rejection, but now, with his hand guiding her, she was something else. The power dynamic between them was shifting, and Catherine could feel it in every fiber of her being. She was no longer invisible. The Duke's command had transformed her from a shadow into something far more dangerous. But the tension was far from over. As they made their way to the center of the ballroom, the eyes of the entire room were on them. The whispers started again, louder this time. A mixture of envy, disbelief, and disdain followed them like a storm. The nobles, the ones who had been born into this world of wealth and power, could not believe their eyes. The Duke, their Duke, was with her. The woman who had never been part of their world. Catherine felt their judgment like 1,000 daggers aimed at her back. She could hear their hushed voices, feel their eyes cut through her, but she kept her gaze steady, refusing to flinch. The Duke had chosen her, and that was all that mattered. The crowd parted as they approached the center of the room, the music rising once more, but Catherine couldn't hear it. All she could hear was the pounding of her heart, the soft scrape of her heels on the marble floor, and the steady, commanding steps of the Duke beside her. His presence was like a wall, solid, unmovable, and yet she felt both protected and trapped by it. His grip on her hand tightened, pulling her closer as they reached the center. The room fell into a deeper silence, the tension thickening. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as she realized that they were now the focus of everyone's attention. But it wasn't just the nobles who watched them, it was the world itself. The Duke stood tall, his posture perfect, exuding power, as if the very air around him bent to his will. And Catherine, with her hand still held firmly in his, stood by his side like a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand. As the whispers continued to swell, a figure stepped forward from the crowd. Lady Arabella, one of the highest-ranking women in the room, the one with the perfect smile and the perfect family, looked at Catherine with a mix of disdain and disbelief. She was tall, poised, and confident, everything Catherine had never been, everything Catherine could never be. But in that moment, Arabella's eyes were cold, her gaze sharpening as she approached them. "Your Grace," she said, her voice sweet, yet laced with something darker. "Are you certain this is the woman you've chosen?" The question hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Catherine felt the room shift. The temperature seemed to drop, the space between them suddenly vast. Arabella's gaze flicked to Catherine, then back to the Duke, her smile thin and knowing. The Duke didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the question, his face an implacable mask. But his grip on Catherine's hand tightened again, this time almost painfully. It was a subtle move, but it was enough. Catherine felt the shift. The power had always been with him. But now, in front of the crowd, it was all too clear. He wasn't just a Duke. He was the Duke, and no one dared question him. "I am certain," the Duke said, his voice low, his words deliberate. The crowd fell silent again. Arabella's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more. She had been put in her place, and everyone knew it. But as the tension in the room shifted, Catherine could feel the weight of the eyes on her once more. The judgment was still there, thick in the air. It was as if the world were waiting for her to falter, to prove that she wasn't worthy of the Duke's attention. But Catherine didn't falter. She couldn't. Not now. She stood tall, her back straight, her gaze steady as she faced the crowd. The Duke's hand was still on hers, and for the first time, Catherine realized something she hadn't understood before. She wasn't just a pawn in his game. She was his chosen. And that, in this world of power and privilege, was everything. The whispers continued, but Catherine no longer heard them. All she could hear was the steady rhythm of her own breath, the pulse of the Duke's hand on hers, and the undeniable truth that the power dynamic had shifted. She was no longer the invisible one. She was no longer the outcast. She was by his side, and nothing, no one, could change that. Catherine could feel the weight of the room press in on her as she walked beside Duke Edward, each step measured, deliberate, a constant reminder of the shift that had just taken place. The ballroom, once a grand sea of glittering gowns and sharp suits, now felt like a cage. The whispers were deafening, despite the elegant music still playing in the background. The aristocrats who had once barely glanced at her were now watching her with eyes full of judgment, curiosity, and something far colder. She felt it in every look, every hushed murmur. She was the outsider, the one they never expected to be here, the one who had been chosen by the Duke. It didn't sit well with them, and Catherine could feel their resentment like a tangible force. They had all come to this event to see who would win the Duke's favor, and here she was, an unwelcome surprise in their perfect little world. But none of that mattered. Not anymore. The Duke had made his choice, and in that choice, he had shifted the balance of power in the room. His hand was still firmly on hers, a constant anchor, yet Catherine couldn't help but notice how the room seemed to react to the power he exuded. She wasn't just walking beside him. She was being marked, claimed in ways she had never imagined. As they moved through the crowd, Catherine couldn't ignore the sharp, calculating glances that followed them. She could feel the eyes of Lady Arabella, the aristocratic queen bee of the room, on her. Arabella had not been pleased when the Duke had chosen Catherine, and now, she was making her displeasure known with every movement. Arabella stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her figure poised, and yet there was an underlying tension in the way she approached them. Her eyes, cold and disdainful, landed on Catherine as if she were an insect to be crushed. "Your Grace," Arabella said, her voice sweet but laced with venom. "I must admit, I did not expect you to choose her." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. The way Arabella said her made it clear she thought Catherine unworthy of the Duke's attention, and perhaps unworthy of being in the same room as the nobility. The room seemed to hold its breath as the Duke's grip on Catherine's hand tightened slightly, a subtle but powerful gesture. He turned to face Arabella, his expression unreadable, but there was something in the way his jaw clenched, the way his posture shifted, that told Catherine this was not going to be an ordinary exchange. "Lady Arabella," the Duke said, his voice as smooth as silk but sharp as a blade, "I choose who I wish to choose." The words hung in the air, clear and final. Arabella's eyes flashed with something dangerous, but she did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked between Catherine and the Duke, her gaze cold and calculating. It was as if she were trying to figure out if there was some mistake, if the Duke had made an error in his judgment. Catherine could feel the tension rise between them, the power shift so palpable that it was almost a physical force. Arabella's stance was stiff, her hands clenched at her sides as if restraining herself from doing something far worse. But she held her composure. The Duke didn't let her have the last word. He turned his gaze back to Catherine, his eyes softening just the slightest bit, but enough to send a jolt of warmth through her. It was the first time since their encounter that Catherine saw something other than cold calculation in his eyes. For a brief moment, she wondered if it was pity, but the warmth quickly disappeared, replaced once more by the impenetrable mask of the Duke. But it didn't matter. It didn't need to. The Duke had spoken. He had chosen her, and no one in this room would dare challenge that. Arabella remained silent, but her face betrayed her true feelings. She was a queen who had just been dethroned, and Catherine was the one who had taken her place. It wasn't just the Duke's choice. It was a statement, a declaration that the power dynamic in this room was no longer what it had been. Catherine felt the weight of it as they continued walking through the ballroom, her heart pounding with every step. It was as though the entire room was closing in on them, the air thick with the unspoken resentment. But there was also something else. A shift, an opening. Catherine had once been invisible to these people, and now she was the center of attention. The whispers had turned to stares, the looks of disdain replaced by looks of curiosity, perhaps even envy. And it was all because of the Duke. The weight of the crowd's gaze was suffocating, but Catherine didn't flinch. She held her head high, her body poised. For the first time, she felt a sense of power. Not her own power. No, that was still far out of reach. But the Duke's power, the way it surrounded her, protected her, and made everyone in the room bend to his will. The shift was complete. Catherine was no longer the one on the outside, looking in. She was standing by his side, and no one, not Arabella, not anyone in this room, could take that away from her. The tension hung in the air, but it wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was anticipation. What would happen next? The crowd waited, the Duke waited, and Catherine, she was ready. She could feel the power coursing through her, through them both. And for the first time in her life, she realized that this game of power was one she was no longer willing to lose. Catherine could feel the eyes of the entire ballroom on her as the Duke led her further into the heart of the gathering. The music had grown quieter, the chatter had softened, and all that remained was the sound of their footsteps echoing across the marble floor. She could sense the shift in the air, the tension so thick she could almost touch it. It wasn't just the weight of the people around them. It was the weight of the Duke's presence, pulling her in like gravity. His grip on her hand was firm, yet there was a coldness to it, as if he were trying to keep her grounded in a world she didn't belong to. But even as she stood there, beside him, she knew something had changed. She was no longer just a part of the crowd. She was the center of it, and the others were watching her, each person calculating, judging. The whispers were sharper now, and Catherine could feel the eyes of the nobility cut into her skin. They saw her as an outsider, as someone who didn't belong in the Duke's world. But she didn't flinch. She couldn't. Not now. Not when the Duke had chosen her. The sound of heels clicking against the floor caught her attention. Lady Arabella had returned, her presence cutting through the crowd like a knife. Her eyes, narrowed with disdain, flicked over Catherine and then settled on the Duke. Arabella's smile was tight, forced, but there was something about it that made Catherine's stomach churn. Arabella had never liked her, and now, with the Duke by her side, the feeling was mutual. Arabella stepped forward, her movements graceful but calculated. "Your Grace," she said, her voice a mixture of sweetness and venom. "I see you've decided to make an interesting choice." Her words hung in the air, and Catherine could feel them like a slap. Arabella's gaze turned to Catherine, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The room, the music, the world around them, it all disappeared. It was just the two of them, standing in the midst of a crowd that suddenly felt suffocating. Catherine's heart raced as she locked eyes with Arabella, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. Arabella's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "You're quite brave," I'll give you that, Arabella continued, her voice low enough that only Catherine could hear. But tell me, dear, how long do you think this will last? How long before he tires of you? The question was a needle, sharp and meant to wound. Catherine's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't let the words land. She couldn't afford to let Arabella see her fear, to see the cracks in her carefully built facade. But it was hard. The weight of the room was pressing in on her, and Arabella's gaze never wavered. But then, as if the air had shifted once more, the Duke spoke, his voice steady and calm, cutting through the tension like a blade. Enough, Lady Arabella, he said, his tone as cold as the winter wind. You've said your piece. Now move aside. The words were simple, yet they carried an undeniable weight. Arabella blinked, clearly taken aback by the Duke's dismissal, but she didn't argue. She stepped back, her eyes never leaving Catherine, and a slow, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of her lips. The power dynamic had shifted, but the battle was far from over. As Arabella retreated into the crowd, the Duke turned his attention back to Catherine. His grip on her hand remained strong, but his gaze softened just a fraction. For a moment, Catherine allowed herself to feel the warmth of that gaze. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen. She was chosen. And in that moment, it felt like the Duke was the only thing that mattered. But as the moment passed, the weight of the crowd's eyes returned. The whispers picked up again, louder this time, and Catherine could feel the pressure mounting. It wasn't just Arabella. It wasn't just the noble women who watched her with jealousy. It was the entire room. The world had shifted, but Catherine wasn't sure if it had shifted in her favor. The Duke's presence was undeniable, but even with him beside her, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being tested, that every step she took was a challenge to prove her worth. And then, just as she thought the tension might break, the Duke turned, his hand still clasped around hers, and led her toward the far side of the ballroom. The crowd parted for them, but the whispers followed, a low murmur of disbelief and resentment. Catherine held her head high, her steps measured, even as the world around her seemed to close in. She didn't belong here. She knew that. She had never belonged. But the Duke had chosen her, and that was all that mattered. She had to hold on to that. She had to hold on to him. But with every step, the weight of her new reality pressed down on her. It wasn't just the weight of the Duke's hand on hers. It was the weight of the world watching, waiting for her to stumble. The room felt colder now, the warmth of the Duke's presence a distant memory as the pressure mounted. She wasn't sure if she could take much more of it. But as they reached the far corner of the ballroom, the Duke stopped, his eyes scanning the room, his gaze sharp and calculating. Catherine could feel his presence like a wall beside her, but the tension between them had not dissipated. It was still there, hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. And as the Duke turned to face her, Catherine realized that this was just the beginning. The battle for her place in this world was far from over. She had been chosen, but at what cost? Catherine stood still, her breath shallow, her heart pounding. The Duke's hand was still firm in hers, but it felt different now, heavier somehow, as though it carried the weight of the entire ballroom. The music continued to play, but to Catherine, it was a distant hum. The silence between them was deafening, thick with unspoken words, unacknowledged emotions. The tension, once a subtle undercurrent, now gripped the air with a suffocating force. They were still surrounded by the eyes of the room, but it wasn't just the crowd's whispers she could hear. It was the pounding of her own heart, and the cruel echo of every judgmental glance aimed at her. She had always been invisible in spaces like this, but now, with the Duke at her side, it was as if she had become a target, a symbol of something they could not control. She could feel it in the way they watched her, the way they whispered in hushed tones, as though she were a dirty secret they were all too curious to ignore. The power dynamics were shifting with every step she took beside the Duke. And yet, despite the overwhelming attention, despite the weight of the scrutiny, she could not help but feel that, for the first time, she was being seen. Not for who she was, but for what she represented. The Duke's chosen. The power of his presence was undeniable. He stood tall, his back straight, his every movement deliberate, but Catherine couldn't ignore the subtle shift in his demeanor. It was as though, with every step, he was asserting his dominance, not just over the room, but over her as well. His hand never wavered, but the air between them felt charged, as if something unsaid, something unresolved, was building. The pressure was mounting. Catherine's chest tightened, but she refused to let the fear show. She couldn't. Not with all eyes on her. Not when the Duke was watching. They had reached the center of the ballroom, and Catherine could feel the moment stretch out, hold its breath, waiting for something to break. It was then that Lady Arabella appeared again, as though she had been waiting for this exact moment. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Catherine, and Catherine could feel the challenge in that gaze. Arabella moved closer, a cold smile curling at her lips. "Your Grace," Arabella said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "I see you've decided to make your intentions clear." Her words were meant to be a dagger, but they were wrapped in velvet. Arabella's gaze flicked to Catherine, then back to the Duke. "But tell me, how long will it last, I wonder? How long before you tire of the novelty?" The words were a direct hit, sharp and designed to provoke, but Catherine held her ground. She could feel the Duke's grip on her hand tighten, a subtle shift that spoke volumes. The room fell silent, waiting for the Duke's response. The tension was unbearable. Catherine could feel the eyes of the crowd on them, each one waiting for the next move, wondering how the Duke would handle this challenge. He had always been in control, but Arabella was testing him now, testing his decision. For a moment, the Duke said nothing. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on Arabella, his silence more powerful than any words he could have spoken. Catherine could feel the heat from his body, the strength in his presence. It was a wall, a shield, a quiet promise that no matter what Arabella said, no matter what anyone in this room thought, he was in control. Finally, the Duke's voice broke the silence, low and measured, but it carried with it a weight that left no room for doubt. "Lady Arabella," he said, his words like ice, "your opinion is of no consequence." The room seemed to hold its breath, but Arabella's smile faltered for just a moment before it was replaced by a look of calculated indifference. She nodded, but Catherine could see the flash of something darker in her eyes. Arabella wasn't done yet. The power dynamics had shifted, but Arabella was not ready to let go of the position she had once held. And as Arabella turned to walk away, Catherine felt the weight of the room shift again. It wasn't over. Not yet. The whispers had quieted for a moment, but Catherine could feel them start up again, each word carrying a little more venom, a little more resentment. She was the center of it all now, and she could feel the pressure, the expectation, the judgment of every single person in that room. But the Duke was still there, his hand still on hers, and that was all that mattered. For the first time, she realized that the power in this room wasn't just his. It was theirs, both of theirs. And as the tension swirled around them, as the whispers grew louder, Catherine could feel the weight of their combined presence push against the very walls of the ballroom. She was no longer the outsider, the invisible one. She was his, and that was a force no one could ignore. Catherine's pulse quickened, her heart thudding against her chest as she stood beside Duke Edward, the weight of his hand still firmly holding hers. The ballroom had grown louder, the whispers rising to a fever pitch, but it felt as though the noise had faded into the background, leaving only the thundering of her own heart and the Duke's presence, implacable and unyielding. He was still the center of it all, but she was now a part of it, and the power dynamic between them had shifted so drastically that it left her breathless. The whispers were louder now, sharper, tinged with envy and confusion, but they were no longer just about her. They were about them. She could feel it. She was no longer the invisible woman on the fringes. She had been pulled into the center of this world, thrust into a game she barely understood, but with the Duke by her side, she felt both lost and, for the first time, completely seen. His hand tightened around hers, a subtle but unmistakable gesture that made her body stiffen, her thoughts racing. They were being watched, judged, and yet, his touch grounded her, pulling her back into the present. She was no longer just Catherine Whitmore. She was the Duke's choice. That meant something in this world. It had to. The crowd parted for them as they continued to move through the ballroom. The sea of aristocrats making way as though he was some kind of divine being, his every movement commanding respect. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to suffocate, yet Catherine found herself unable to look away. The room, once so foreign, so overwhelming, now felt like a stage on which she had been thrust into the spotlight. And as they moved forward, the eyes of the nobility fixed on her, Catherine couldn't help but feel the weight of their expectations, the pressure of their judgments. But she stood taller, her head high, her body straight. She was here, by his side, and that was all that mattered. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder once again, and Catherine's gaze flickered to the Duke. His face was unreadable, the mask of a man who had seen it all, a man who commanded respect without a single word. Yet, there was something in the way. He held her hand, something in the slight tension of his grip that spoke volumes. They reached the far side of the ballroom, and for the first time, the Duke paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, his expression as cold and calculating as ever. The power in the room seemed to shift as his eyes settled on Lady Arabella once more. Arabella, still standing on the sidelines, her eyes locked on the Duke and Catherine, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was clear that she hadn't given up. Arabella was still determined to break them apart, to reclaim the power she had once held. And Catherine could feel the heat of her gaze, the simmering resentment and jealousy radiating from her. But it wasn't just Arabella. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the Duke turned to face them all, his presence dominating the space. And with a single glance, the crowd fell silent. It was as if he had commanded it. "Lady Arabella," the Duke said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You seem to have something to say." The words were calm, even polite, but there was an edge to them that made the temperature in the room drop. Catherine could feel the eyes of everyone on her, on them, and for a moment, it felt as though the walls were closing in. The tension was unbearable, but the Duke stood unwavering. Arabella's smile was tight, but her eyes burned with something far more dangerous. She took a step forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Your Grace," she said, her voice a delicate balance of sweetness and venom. "I must admit, I didn't expect this alliance." The word was dripping with scorn, and Catherine could feel her stomach tighten at the implication. Arabella's gaze flickered to her, and Catherine met it with as much composure as she could muster. But Arabella's next words cut through the silence, sharp and venomous. "Tell me, dear, how does it feel to know that you will never be accepted here? That you will always be an outsider, no matter what the Duke may say?" The words were like a slap in the face, but Catherine didn't flinch. She didn't let Arabella see the effect her words had on her. She couldn't. Not now. Not when the Duke was still standing beside her, his hand still holding hers. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the Duke's response. Catherine's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had never been a part of this world. She had never belonged. But now, with the Duke by her side, she felt as though she might. His grip on her hand tightened slightly, a subtle gesture, but one that sent a jolt of electricity through her. She was his, and that fact made everything else irrelevant. The Duke turned his gaze back to Arabella, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Lady Arabella," he said, his voice low, his tone calm, but carrying the weight of centuries of power. "I suggest you remember your place." Arabella's expression faltered for a moment, the mask of politeness slipping, but it was only for a moment. "Your Grace," she said, her voice tight, "I merely stated a truth." The Duke didn't respond. He simply turned away, leading Catherine away from the center of the ballroom. But as they walked, Catherine could feel the weight of the room shift. The power dynamic had changed. Arabella had lost, but the tension in the air hadn't dissipated. It was still there, hanging between them, and Catherine knew that this was far from over. As they walked toward the far side of the room, she couldn't help but feel the weight of every judgmental gaze still upon her. But she stood tall, her heart steady, her grip on the Duke's hand unwavering. She had been chosen, and in this world of power, that was everything. Catherine could feel the tension building, the weight of the entire room pressing in on her with every step. The Duke's grip on her hand remained firm, yet there was an intensity in his touch that made her pulse race. They were no longer merely walking through the ballroom. They were moving through a battlefield, the stakes higher than she had ever imagined. The whispers of the nobility had reached a crescendo, the sharp glances and veiled insults cutting through her like arrows. Yet, there was a quiet force between them now, the Duke's unspoken promise to protect her, whether she wanted it or not. The crowd parted, their faces unreadable, their thoughts clearly written in the lines of their brows. Catherine felt like a prize, a possession they all coveted yet resented. She could feel their gaze as they all watched her with barely concealed disdain. Yet, through it all, the Duke was still by her side, leading her, as though she were the most important thing in this room. But that's when it happened. A voice rang out, sharp and cutting through the tense atmosphere like a dagger. "How long do you think you'll keep her, Your Grace?" The words came from none other than Lord William, a man whose reputation for arrogance was known far and wide. Catherine froze. The room seemed to hold its breath, the noise around them vanishing as everyone turned to look at the Duke. There was no mistaking the intent behind Lord William's question. It was a challenge, an affront, and it carried the weight of years of privilege and power that had been built on the backs of people like Catherine. The Duke's expression didn't shift, but Catherine could feel the tension in the air as he turned slowly, his gaze locking onto Lord William. For a moment, everything stood still, frozen in time, as if the world itself were waiting for the Duke to respond. The room was a pressure cooker, every second drawing them closer to the explosion that was inevitable. Then, finally, the Duke spoke. His voice was calm, but the words were laced with such a chilling authority that it sent a shiver through Catherine's spine. "She will remain by my side for as long as I choose, Lord William," he said, each word a hammer driving home the power of his statement. Catherine's heart skipped a beat. The Duke's words hung in the air, a declaration not just to Lord William, but to the entire room. He was drawing the line, staking his claim in front of everyone. The power dynamics had shifted once again, and Catherine could feel the weight of it settle on her shoulders. The world around them seemed to snap back into focus, but the tension hadn't dissipated. It had only grown, thicker and more suffocating than before. Lord William's face darkened, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You can't be serious," he scoffed. "A woman like her? She's beneath you." The words hit Catherine like a slap in the face, but she held her ground. She refused to let them see her falter. She wasn't invisible anymore, and neither was the Duke. But the Duke was not done. His gaze never wavered from Lord William, his eyes cold and unyielding. "You forget your place, Lord William," he said, his voice low but full of power. "You would do well to remember who holds the power in this room." The silence that followed was deafening. It was as though the very air had thickened, the weight of the Duke's words pressing down on everyone in the room. Lord William seemed to shrink under the force of the Duke's presence, his earlier arrogance faltering for just a moment. But that moment was enough. The room had shifted, and everyone in it knew it. The Duke was in control. Catherine's pulse was still racing, but there was something else now, something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't insecurity. It was the dawning realization that, for the first time in her life, she had power. The Duke had chosen her, and in doing so, he had given her something no one had ever given her before: visibility. She was seen. She was part of this world, whether the others liked it or not. As the Duke turned back to her, his expression softened just slightly, a flicker of something that might have been pride or maybe even affection, though she couldn't be sure. His hand, still holding hers, was a reminder that, in this moment, she was not alone. The world was watching, but the Duke was by her side, and that made all the difference. He had chosen her, and nothing, not Lord William's disdain, not the judgment of the crowd, could take that away. But the battle wasn't over. The tension was still there, thick and palpable. The whispers continued, but now, they were tinged with a new sense of respect, a new recognition. Ballroom, the weight of the moment hung in the air. The tension hadn't broken, it had only intensified. But Catherine no longer feared it. She was part of this world now, part of the game they all played, and she would not be sidelined again. She would stand by the Duke's side, whatever the consequences. And together, they would face whatever came next. Catherine stood frozen as the room seemed to pulse with tension. The weight of the Duke's words still hung in the air, thick with the promise of power. She was no longer the outsider, the invisible noblewoman left to the whispers of society. The Duke had chosen her, had made her visible to the very people who had once ignored her. But in that moment, she felt the unsettling realization that the battle wasn't over. The shifting power between them had not yet fully revealed itself. As they stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the quiet murmurs of the nobility, Catherine's mind raced. Arabella's words had lingered, sharp and pointed, in the back of her mind. Was this all truly enough? The power of the Duke's choice, was it as unbreakable as it seemed? Her thoughts were interrupted by the Duke's voice, low and commanding as it cut through the noise of the crowd. "Stay close," he whispered, his hand tightening around hers as they began to move again through the ballroom. There was no room for hesitation. His words weren't a request, they were a command. As they made their way through the room, Catherine felt the eyes of everyone on her, the same judgmental gazes, but now there was something different in their looks. A recognition. They were watching her not just as a woman of low status who had been chosen by the Duke, but as someone who now stood beside him, someone who held his attention. She could feel their resentment, but also a shift in their curiosity that bordered on fear. It was then that the moment of revelation hit, and with it, the shift in power. The Duke had led her to the far corner of the ballroom, a secluded alcove where the noise of the party seemed to fade away. The walls, once elegant and distant, now seemed to close in on them as the Duke faced her, his eyes unreadable. His hand remained firmly on hers, but there was a strange sense of finality in his presence. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the ground beneath her shift, a subtle change in the atmosphere that made the world around them feel like it was holding its breath. "Catherine," the Duke said, his voice low but laced with something heavier. It wasn't the tone of a man speaking to a noblewoman by his side. It was the voice of someone who had decided something crucial, something that would change everything. "There is something you need to know," he continued, his gaze intense as it bore into hers. The words sent a chill through her, the tension rising. The power dynamic between them, which had once seemed clear, was beginning to waver. For the first time, Catherine felt herself being drawn into something she didn't fully understand. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She was bracing herself, unsure of what he was about to reveal. The Duke took a breath, and in that moment, everything seemed to freeze. The weight of his next words seemed to hold the entire room still, like a tidal wave poised to crash. "I didn't choose you because of your status, or your beauty, or the way others look at you," he said, his voice quiet but the power in it undeniable. "I chose you because you have something they can't see, something they'll never understand." Catherine's mind raced as she processed his words, but before she could speak, the Duke continued, his hand still firmly clasped around hers. "You are the key to something much bigger, something they won't ever be able to touch. They will never understand why I chose you, but that's why they will always resent you." The words cut through her, each one sending a shock through her system. She had always known she was different, but she had never known that difference would place her at the center of something much larger than she could comprehend. The Duke's gaze softened, but only for a moment. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the softness was gone, replaced once more by the cold, calculating power that had defined him from the beginning. "You are not just my choice, Catherine," he said, his grip on her hand tightening. "You are a weapon." Catherine's heart raced as his words sank in. She wasn't just a woman chosen for her beauty or her station. She was a tool, a part of a game she had never asked to play. The realization hit her like a thunderclap, but before she could process it, the Duke pulled her closer, his presence overwhelming. In the space between them, there was an undeniable pull, an electric current that neither of them could escape. He leaned in just slightly, his breath warm against her ear as he spoke once more, his words carrying the weight of an unspoken promise. "You will be the one to reshape this world, Catherine, but only if you trust me." Her heart was pounding, the tension between them building to a breaking point. She could feel the pressure of his words, of his gaze, of the weight of everything he had just revealed. The ballroom around them seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of them standing in the eye of the storm. She was no longer the invisible woman. She was no longer the outsider. She was part of the Duke's world, and in that world, there were no guarantees, no promises, only power. And as the moment stretched on, Catherine realized that this was it. This was the moment that would change everything. She could feel the shift in the air, the shift in her, in him, in everything. The Duke had shown her what he truly wanted, what he truly saw in her, and now she had to decide whether to accept it, to embrace the power he was offering, or to walk away. The room seemed to come back into focus, the whispers growing louder once more, but this time, Catherine didn't feel the weight of their judgment. She was no longer the girl they had once dismissed. She was the woman who held the Duke's future in her hands, and she would shape it, just as he had promised. Catherine stood still, her breath trapped in her chest, as the Duke's words echoed in her mind. "You are a weapon." The weight of the truth sank in like a stone in her stomach. She had thought she understood her place, but now, standing in the midst of this grand ballroom, she realized how little she truly knew. The Duke had chosen her. Yes, but it wasn't out of affection, nor because of some romantic ideal. It wasn't even because of her beauty or her social status. He had chosen her for a reason much darker, much more complicated than anything she had imagined. She was a tool in his game, a part of a plan that no one, least of all her, could comprehend. And that realization hit her with a force she hadn't been prepared for. The Duke's presence beside her was now a constant reminder of the shifting power dynamics between them, a reminder of her place in his world. The weight of his grip on her hand, once a comforting anchor, now felt like a chain, tying her to a future she didn't choose. The whispers around them had only grown louder, but they were no longer directed solely at her. Now, they were aimed at both of them. The room was alive with curiosity, speculation, and even fear. Catherine could feel their eyes on them, like 1,000 arrows piercing her skin. And yet, despite the weight of their judgment, despite the suffocating pressure in the air, the Duke never once looked away. His gaze remained unwavering, fixed on the crowd, as if daring anyone to challenge him. But the tension between them hadn't dissipated. It had only grown more pronounced, more dangerous. They had crossed a line, one that neither of them could return from. The crowd parted once more as the Duke led her further into the ballroom. Each step felt like it carried them closer to the precipice, to the moment when everything would either fall apart or fall into place. And Catherine couldn't decide which one she feared more. They reached the far side of the room, and for a brief moment, the Duke stopped, his gaze sweeping across the gathering. He didn't speak, but there was something in the way he held himself, something in the way he commanded the space around him that made the room fall into a hushed silence. It was as if everyone in the room was waiting for him to make a move, for him to say something that would shift the balance once more. And then, without a word, he turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers. The intensity of his gaze left her breathless, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the moment, the electricity that crackled in the air between them, and for the first time, Catherine realized just how much she had already been pulled into his world. She was no longer just an observer, no longer just the woman who had been chosen. She was part of his game now, his chosen, and there was no going back. The Duke's voice broke through the silence, low and steady, but full of an undeniable authority. "They don't understand you, Catherine," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "They will never understand why I chose you. But that's what makes you powerful." The words hit her like a blow. They cut through her, piercing the walls she had so carefully built around herself. The Duke had known all along. He had known what she could become, what she could offer, and he had used that to pull her into his world. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was a player in this game, a tool in the Duke's hand. And in that moment, Catherine realized the full extent of the power she had allowed him to wield over her. She had trusted him. She had believed in him. But now, she was beginning to wonder if that trust had been misplaced. The Duke stepped closer, his presence overwhelming as he closed the distance between them. His hand brushed against hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her skin. But there was no warmth in his touch. Only power. Only control. "You're stronger than they think," the Duke continued, his voice almost a whisper now. "You have more power than you realize, Catherine, but you must choose how to use it. Whether you will remain my ally or my enemy." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Catherine felt the weight of them sink in. This was it, the moment of truth. She could feel the heat of the room, the pressure mounting, the power dynamics shifting in ways she couldn't fully understand. And yet, in that moment, she realized something else. The Duke had chosen her because he saw something in her, something raw, something dangerous. But what did that mean for her? What did it mean for them? She didn't know. But she did know that everything had changed. The power between them had shifted. The lines had been redrawn. And now, the question was whether she would accept this new reality or fight against it. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of the unspoken words hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Catherine's mind raced, but her body remained still, caught between the Duke's unrelenting gaze and the chaos that swirled around them. The ballroom was no longer a place of celebration. It had become a battlefield, and she was standing at the center of it. The Duke's words had already set the wheels in motion. She was no longer just a woman chosen by the Duke. She was part of a much larger game, a game with stakes higher than she had ever imagined. And as the Duke turned away, leading her further into the heart of the ballroom, Catherine felt the weight of that truth settle over her. The game had only just begun. Catherine stood before the Duke, her heart still racing from the weight of the revelation. The room had quieted as the final strings of the last song lingered in the air, the echoes of whispers now replaced by a heavy, unbroken silence. The tension between them was undeniable, yet there was something else in the air now, something different. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and as she looked at the Duke, his gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that left her breathless. It wasn't the calculating coldness she had become familiar with. There was something deeper there, something more human. The Duke had shown her a part of himself she hadn't expected, a side that softened his otherwise impenetrable exterior. But the question remained, what now? Catherine's mind raced, the emotions swirling inside her like a storm. She had thought she knew who he was, but now, with everything laid bare, she realized how much of him she had never understood. How much she had failed to see. The Duke, too, stood still, his expression unreadable, but Catherine could feel the shift. The game had changed. What had once been a world of power and manipulation now seemed less certain, less secure. She had been chosen, yes, but for a reason she hadn't fully grasped until now. She wasn't simply an accessory, a tool to be wielded. No, she was something more. His equal? Or his undoing? She couldn't be sure. His grip on her hand tightened slightly, drawing her back to the present, his presence overwhelming. The room had once felt suffocating, oppressive, but now, with him beside her, it felt like a stage. And they were the players, caught in a dance they couldn't control. She could feel the eyes of the room on them, on her, but now, there was a difference. They weren't just spectators anymore. They were witnesses. Witnesses to the unfolding of something neither she nor the Duke had fully anticipated. The air around them crackled, charged with unspoken emotions. The shift had been so sudden, so dramatic, that Catherine wasn't sure if she had fully adjusted to it. The Duke had chosen her not just for his convenience, not for power alone. No, there was something more, something far deeper. His choice had been about control, yes, but it had also been about trust. The realization settled on her like a weight she hadn't been prepared for. He trusted her. Or perhaps, more accurately, he wanted her to trust him. The thought lingered in her mind, twisting and turning as she tried to understand what it meant for her, for them. But before she could dive deeper into the complexity of the situation, the Duke spoke again, his voice low, but it resonated with authority. "You are more than just a tool in my game, Catherine," he said, his eyes piercing through her, searching for something, an answer, perhaps. "You always have been." The words hit her like a wave, crashing over her, but there was no escaping them. The world around her seemed to freeze for just a moment, the weight of the moment pushing everything else aside. She was no longer just a pawn. She wasn't merely the chosen one. She had become part of the very fabric of his world, a world she had once been so far removed from. And now, she was standing at the very heart of it. Catherine felt the pull, the undeniable force that seemed to have both bound her to him and yet set her free. The room, the world, had shifted in that moment, and everything had changed. She was standing beside the Duke, not beneath him, not in his shadow. No, she stood with him, his equal, for better or worse. But the Duke wasn't done. His hand moved, releasing hers, but the absence of his touch felt even more powerful than when he had been holding her. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers, and for the first time, Catherine saw something in his eyes that wasn't just cold calculation. There was a flicker of something softer, something real. "You don't need to hide from what we've become, Catherine," he whispered, his voice barely audible, yet it carried through her like a thread connecting them. "We've both changed." The words echoed in her mind, reverberating through her as she stood in the quiet aftermath of his declaration. It wasn't just the Duke who had been altered by this. It was her too. The very air between them had changed. It was no longer filled with secrets and power plays. It was filled with the truth, raw, unfiltered, and undeniable. They had both made choices. And now, they would live with the consequences. Catherine could feel the weight of that truth sink deep into her soul. The tension was still there, lingering in the space between them, but it was different now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind. It was something else, something electric. Something that pulsed with the potential for more. But what more? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Catherine finally allowed herself to meet the Duke's gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in their twisted, complicated dance, she didn't feel like the outsider. She wasn't the pawn, the victim, or the chosen one. She was something else. She was his equal, and she wasn't sure what that meant. Not yet, but she knew one thing for certain. The power dynamic had shifted, and whatever came next, she would face it on her terms. As the crowd watched in tense silence, Catherine took a step forward, the Duke's gaze following her every movement. The world around them seemed to slow, as if time itself had stopped to witness the change, the turning of the tide. The moment of revelation had passed. The room, the world, was different now, and so were they. Catherine stood in the heart of the ballroom, surrounded by the quiet murmurs of the aristocracy. The weight of the moment was unbearable, the tension in the air thick and heavy, pressing in from all sides. Yet, as she stood there, next to the Duke, she felt a strange sense of clarity. The power had shifted, not just between them, but in the very air around them. She had once been invisible, overlooked, forgotten. But now, she was standing at the center of this world, not as a pawn, but as an equal, his equal. The Duke's hand was still at her back, his touch firm and unwavering, a silent reminder that she was no longer the girl who had walked into this room just hours before. She had changed. They both had. The whispers had died down, but the weight of the crowd's gaze still hung in the air. Everyone in the room was watching, waiting, expecting something. But Catherine no longer cared. She didn't care about their judgment, about their expectations. She cared only about the Duke, about the shift in their dynamic, and about the power that now flowed between them. She had learned the hard way that in this world, power was everything. The Duke had given her that power, not as a gift, but as a test, a challenge. He had shown her what she was capable of, and now, as she stood beside him, she understood what he had been asking of her all along. She was no longer the helpless woman waiting to be saved. She was the woman who had taken control of her own fate. And in that moment, Catherine knew she had won. The Duke's gaze softened, just for a moment, before it returned to its usual steely resolve. He looked down at her, and for the first time, there was something almost tender in his expression. But it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had appeared. He was still the Duke, powerful and commanding, but there was a subtle shift in him now, something that made Catherine believe, for the first time, that he truly saw her. He didn't just want her as a pawn in his game. He wanted her by his side, as an equal, in the fight for control of their world. As the Duke turned, he guided her toward the center of the ballroom, the crowd parting once more to allow them through. But this time, it was different. The air around them was charged with something new, something that no one could deny. The Duke and Catherine were no longer just players in this game. They were the game. The music swelled as they reached the heart of the room, and in that moment, everything seemed to freeze. The Duke stopped, turning to face Catherine, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. The room was silent, every eye on them, every breath held in anticipation. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. And then, the Duke spoke. "You've made your choice, Catherine," he said, his voice steady, yet laced with a quiet intensity. "You've chosen to stand by my side, and that choice will define everything. Not just for you, but for both of us." His words hit her like a wave, crashing over her, and for the first time, she realized just how far she had come. She had been a woman with nothing, but now she was standing here, in the heart of this world, as an equal to the Duke. It was a power shift that no one could have predicted, least of all her. She looked up at him, her heart racing, her mind spinning, but she didn't look away. "I choose you," she said, her voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "I choose this. I choose us." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had come before, everything they had fought for. The Duke's gaze softened for just a moment, and then, without a word, he reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek. It was a gentle touch, but it was enough. In that moment, everything else faded away. The whispers, the judgments, the expectations, they didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the connection between them, the bond that had been forged through the trials they had faced together. As the Duke stepped back, he took her hand in his once more, his grip firm and sure. The room, still watching, seemed to hold its breath, but Catherine didn't notice. She was no longer concerned with what the world thought. She was standing beside the Duke, and in that moment, she knew that nothing else mattered. They were equals now, bound together by power.